You're watching The Legal Breakdown. Glenn, we've got the most egregious example of the weaponization of DOJ that we've seen thus far. I'm going to put a tweet right here on this screen from a New York Times reporter, Glenn Thrush. Ed Martin, interim U.S. attorney in D.C., quietly pushed a plan to impanel a grand jury to investigate a bellicose comment Chuck Schumer made and retracted in 2020. DOJ balked, but it underscored Martin's intention to use federal law enforcement to target Trump's foes. So what do you make of the fact that yet again we are seeing one of the most powerful people in Washington, D.C., the U.S. Attorney in D.C., the office that you worked at for more than a decade, use his power not to go after the regular priorities that law enforcement would go after, not to go after domestic terrorists or criminals, but rather to continue investigating Democrats over and over again?
You know, Brian, I think this reinforces the conclusion we had already reached about Ed Martin, who Donald Trump made the top prosecutor in Washington, D.C., the United States Attorney for the District of Columbia, supervising about 325 federal prosecutors. He is at best wildly incompetent, and he is at worst somebody who has shown a willingness to serve as an attack dog for Donald Trump, going after his enemies without any regard for the rule of law or the ethics of our practice. And so here is what this post by Glenn Thrush tells us. It looks like within days of Trump being inaugurated, this guy, Ed Martin, interim U.S. attorney for D.C., wanted to open a grand jury investigation into Chuck Schumer, right? Because Chuck Schumer was at a rally and he was making a political speech. We're going to set aside the whole speech or debate clause protection, which is very broad, which essentially says anything that legislators do that could be considered part of their legislative duties, including giving speeches, generally can't be touched, can't be prosecuted. They have speech or debate clause immunity. We're going to set aside that legal technicality that also cuts against
that pesky little detail.
I hate
of the Constitution.
Yeah, I hate when the Constitution gets in the way of some good political retribution.
Right.
So
right.
Here is precisely what Chuck Schumer said at that rally. And Brian, I am reading from Ed Martin's letter to Chuck Schumer, which is dated January 21st. He wasted no time acting unethically. He says that he is requesting that Chuck Schumer clarify some comments he made on March 4, 2020. And here is what he quotes Chuck Schumer as saying, quote, "I want to tell you, Gorsuch, I want to tell you, Kavanaugh, you have released the whirlwind and you will pay the price. You won't know what hit you if you go forward with these awful decisions," close quote. Now, to say that that is the kind of direct threat that would warrant a criminal investigation and possible prosecution, a threat has to be clear, direct, unambiguous, like, hey, Brian, I'm going to blank you. I'm going to hurt you. That kind of direct, unequivocal, unmistakable communication of a threat. This is perhaps hyperbolic political speech, but for Ed Martin to then send Chuck Schumer a letter saying, I want you to explain yourself, let me quickly add that U.S. attorneys and federal prosecutors don't send letters to people they suspect of committing crime saying, will you please write me back and explain whether you committed a crime or not. That's not the way we investigate crime as federal prosecutors. You know, but even worse, he wanted to potentially abuse the grand jury process by impaneling a grand jury, which is up to 23 members of the community, to investigate the potential crimes of Chuck Schumer, this alleged threat that he may have made, which is not a legally chargeable threat in any event. So listen, this is what Ed Martin is about. I will tell you, Brian, that post that you put up by Glenn Thrush, I'm going to say the two most important words in it are DOJ balked. What does that mean? Even the Department of Justice at that point would not authorize Ed Martin to do something that was this unethical, something that was this egregious, a departure from the way we practice prosecutorial business.
Glenn, if if Ed Martin had actually gone forward and impaneled this grand jury, what happens at that point? Because there's no chargeable crime. And so you're taking all of the steps as if this was legitimate crime, but you've got Chuck Schumer, who made no clear or unambiguous threat. You've got Chuck Schumer, who is a legislator and therefore protected by speech or debate. And so what's the actual crime once you've gone through all the steps of actually impaneling a grand jury, taking Americans who have better things to do, real crimes to focus on as members of grand juries, and actually put them on the stand for this thing?
Yeah, Brian, I have actually a two-part answer to that question. First of all, when we impanel a grand jury as prosecutors, basically the prosecutors have the run of the evidence and information they present to the grand jury. People may not know that the prosecutors who impanel these grand juries also act as legal advisors to the grand jury. So we will present all the evidence. We can put witnesses and documents and videotapes, because this was caught on tape at this rally. These things Chuck Schumer said, we can present it all to the grand jury. And then we will advise the grand jury on the law of communicating a threat. And we will make an argument in our view. Now, we are what's called officers of the court. We have to act honorably and ethically when we're advising the grand jury, but we will tell them whether, in our opinion, the evidence that we've presented to them satisfies the elements of the crime. In other words, we will either urge them to vote out an indictment based on the evidence we've presented to them, or we will say, it's not quite there, so we're not going to ask you to vote out an indictment. But can you see how Ed Martin might be able to manipulate the outcome of what a grand jury might do? There's the old saying, a grand jury will indict a ham sandwich. Well,
Right.
Not in my opinion and experience, not if the prosecutor is doing an honest and ethical job in presenting the evidence and making, arguments that are based in the law, that are supported in the law. So that is the first part of the answer. That's the process that Ed Martin, if he chose to manipulate it, could perhaps manipulate a grand jury into indicting Chuck Schumer, even though there is no cognizable crime. But here is the second part of the answer. Just opening a grand jury and subpoenaing lots of witnesses, for example, to go in and testify about these horrible things that Chuck Schumer said, that can have a chilling effect. That can send a message that even if you are out there engaging in protected speech, whether it's First Amendment protected free speech or whether it's protected by the speech or debate clause that members of Congress enjoy, if you're an enemy of Donald Trump, we may come after you anyway. So it has a chilling effect just opening a grand jury and presenting evidence and witnesses. And the final point on that score, Brian, is witnesses are not prohibited from saying to the media, saying publicly, I was subpoenaed in a criminal investigation of Chuck Schumer. I had to testify in a grand jury about what Chuck Schumer did. How do you think that will land with the average consumer of news,
Right,
hearing that a criminal grand jury is up and running against Chuck Schumer? So people should know grand jury secrecy rules apply to prosecutors, apply to grand jurors, but they don't apply to witnesses. So witnesses can go out and announce Chuck Schumer's being criminally investigated.
Real quick note for those who are watching right now. Obviously, this administration, in even the short time that it's been in office, has been perfectly content to use their positions of power, to abuse their positions of power, to investigate political opponents or critics of this administration, of this White House. The same goes for, of course, media figures like Glenn and I. So the biggest antidote to that abuse at the hands of this federal government is to make sure that we have an audience big enough that we can continue talking to, and that they're not successful at suppressing. So just a quick note for those who are watching, if you're not yet subscribed to both of our channels, please take this opportunity to subscribe, as we have seen this administration and these U.S. attorneys continue to abuse their positions of authority to quash dissent, which includes folks like us. Glenn, we had spoken about these letters of inquiry which aren't real things that U.S. attorneys usually give. They don't give like a big heads up to have the targets of their investigations explain away their actions. Clearly, the impact of this is to have a chilling effect, to show other people that if you get a big spooky letter from the DOJ, that this will prevent other people from speaking out against this administration, against this White House. Why do you presume that Ed Martin is doing something that doesn't exist in his position? Is it because he's too incompetent? Is it because or just too corrupt to even care?
It could be one or the other or a combination of both. I can't say. What I can say, Brian, is he has displayed his incompetence over and over and over again, not understanding how we go about investigating or prosecuting crime. That is perhaps not surprising. The man hasn't spent one day in his entire career as a prosecutor, never prosecuted so much as a traffic ticket. He was a defense attorney representing J6 defendants. He was, part of the Stop the Steal movement by his own admission. You can see him carrying the signs. So, it's at a minimum, it's incompetence. But let me go back to those two words. When he tried to do this, DOJ balked. In other words, even Donald Trump's Department of Justice said, yeah, Ed, you can't do it. We're not giving you authority. Now, mind you, the reason I read the date of the letter, January 21st, I don't think it was fully Donald Trump's Department of Justice that pushed back against Ed Martin one day after Donald Trump was sworn in. So, we can certainly take something from DOJ balking as a positive sign, but I think that was before Pam Bondi, the current Attorney General, was in place. And I wonder whether DOJ would still balk and tell Ed Martin to stand down.
Yeah, I agree. Let's finish off with this. Glenn, as we continue to see Ed Martin abuse his position of power and continue to send these letters of inquiry, if we're in a position where, for example, the DOJ is not there to serve as a bulwark against Ed Martin's worst excesses, and they do allow some of these processes to move forward, and you do have these prosecutors who are serving as legal advisors to the grand jury, where's the bulwark against any of these corrupt or unconstitutional processes moving forward? Is it just the judges at that point who might be able to step in and stop something unconstitutional from happening?
Yeah, Brian, that is a whole stream of bad facts and circumstances you just related, because if Ed Martin can hollow out the DC U.S. Attorney's Office and have, corrupt attorneys willing to abuse the grand jury process to go after Donald Trump's political opponents, then yeah, he can probably secure unethical, if not unlawful, indictments against Donald Trump's enemies. But, the point of light that is a true point of light amidst the Trump-induced darkness is the federal bench, the federal judges in Washington, D.C. That's the bench I appeared before, practiced before for decades, both in local court in D.C. and federal court in D.C. Many of these judges are former prosecutors or former public defenders in Washington, D.C. They are well known. They are highly regarded. And I don't wish a vindictive prosecution on anyone. But when the first vindictive prosecution is brought by Donald Trump's dirty DOJ, I predict the federal court judges will, figuratively speaking, cram that vindictive prosecution down the throat of the Ed Martins of the world, and they will not stand for it. And they will probably end up having to refer Ed Martin to the Office of Professional Responsibility for an investigation and perhaps to his own bar counsel. So we have a bulwark. It is the federal court in Washington, D.C., and that ain't nothing.
Well, look, I'm sure that this conversation will continue as we see Ed Martin abuse his position of power and continue to send these letters of inquiry to members of Congress, critics of this administration, so on and so forth. So again, to that exact point, for folks who are watching right now, if you'd like to support us, the best way to do that is to make sure to subscribe to this channel, give us as big a platform as we can so that if these abuses continue to occur, even to folks like us, we're able to get the word out and let people know. The links to both of our channels are right here on the screen. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
And I'm Glenn Kirshner.
You're watching The Legal Breakdown.